There's a number that almost nobody outside of financial markets knows. 100 microseconds. That's 1/10,000th of a second. It's the maximum timing error the U.S. financial system is legally allowed to tolerate between transaction timestamps. Miss that window and trades become unverifiable. Unverifiable trades become disputed trades. Disputed trades become frozen markets. And frozen markets become something the global economy hasn't seen since 2008. A systemic failure cascading faster than any regulator can respond. Now, here's what almost nobody's talking about. That 100 microsecond window is maintained by 31 satellites orbiting 20,200 kilometers above the Earth. Satellites that broadcast unencrypted signals. Signals so weak that a device costing less than $500 can overwhelm them completely. This is not a story about war in space. This is a story about the invisible architecture holding the global economy together, and about what happens when that architecture starts going quiet. Not destroyed, not attacked, just quietly, systematically silenced. There's a term military planners use for what's coming: silent blinding. And the economic consequences are already measurable. To understand why this matters, it helps to start with a question that sounds almost too simple. What exactly is GPS? Most people would say navigation, maps, getting from point A to point B. That answer is correct, and it misses almost everything important. GPS is, at its core, a timing system. Each GPS satellite carries multiple atomic clocks, accurate to 40 nanoseconds. These clocks continuously broadcast time signals toward Earth. Every GPS receiver, whether in a phone, a cargo ship, or a trading terminal, uses those signals not just to calculate position, but to synchronize time. And that time synchronization is the foundation on which the modern economy is built. Consider what happens in the first second after you tap your credit card at a register. Your bank, the merchant's bank, the card network, and a clearinghouse all exchange encrypted messages. Each message carries a timestamp. Those timestamps must align within microseconds to verify the transaction is legitimate, sequential, and non-duplicated. The system that keeps those timestamps aligned across thousands of banks, across dozens of countries, across millions of simultaneous transactions. GPS. Now scale that to the New York Stock Exchange. The NYSE processes approximately 200 billion transactions daily. High-frequency trading firms execute strategies in nanoseconds, not milliseconds, nanoseconds. A single firm might complete 10,000 trades in the time it takes you to blink. Every one of those trades requires a timestamp accurate enough to reconstruct the exact sequence of market events. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission mandates timestamp accuracy to within 100 microseconds of GPS synchronized coordinated universal time. This isn't a technical preference, it's federal regulation. Without it, the legal structure of financial markets collapses. You cannot prove who traded first, you cannot identify front running, you cannot prosecute spoofing. The entire regulatory framework of modern finance depends on GPS continuing to broadcast precise time signals continuously without interruption. The CFTC estimated in 2021 that GPS timing directly supports $1.4 trillion in daily U.S. market activity. That number doesn't represent what GPS is worth. It represents what stops working if GPS stops working. Now consider something that happened on May 6, 2010. In 45 minutes, the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped nearly 1,000 points, then recovered almost as fast. Almost $1 trillion in market value appeared and disappeared within less than an hour. This event is known as the flash crash. Investigators spent months trying to understand it. The conclusion pointed to automated trading algorithms responding to each other faster than human oversight could intervene. A cascade of microsecond decisions that no individual trader initiated and no regulator could stop in real time. The flash crash happened in 2010, when GPS timing was functioning normally. Now ask a different question. What happens when GPS timing isn't functioning normally? What happens when timestamps across different trading systems begin drifting, not by hours, not by minutes, but by microseconds, just enough to create sequencing ambiguities that algorithms interpret as market signals? That question is no longer theoretical. In 2016, a GPS satellite anomaly designated SVN23 broadcast incorrect timing signals for approximately 13 hours before the problem was identified and corrected. During those 13 hours, receivers globally locked onto the faulty signal. Equipment ranging from telecommunications networks to financial systems reported timing discrepancies. Dozens of institutions filed incident reports. The event was caused by a software error during routine maintenance. It was not an attack, but it demonstrated something important. The global economy experienced measurable disruption from a single malfunctioning satellite for 13 hours due to a software update. That's the baseline vulnerability before anyone starts trying to exploit it deliberately. To understand where exploitation is heading, it helps to look at what's already happened in places where GPS jamming has become routine. Eastern Ukraine. February 2022 through the present. When Russian forces advanced, GPS denial came with them. Ukrainian military units reported navigation failures across combat zones, but the economic signals reached further than the front lines. Commercial agricultural equipment across eastern Ukraine, GPS-guided planters and harvesters, stopped functioning reliably during planting and harvest seasons. Ukraine supplies approximately 10% of the world's wheat and 15% of its corn. Precision agriculture equipment had increased yields by 20 to 30% compared to manual farming methods. When GPS failed, those yield improvements disappeared. Farmers reverted to older, less efficient methods. The crop production shortfalls contributed to global grain price increases that persisted through 2023. GPS jamming in Ukraine didn't just disrupt a military campaign, it contributed to food price inflation experienced by consumers in countries that had no idea Ukraine was even being jammed. That's the supply chain reach of satellite dependency. The Red Sea provided a different lesson. In late 2023, commercial vessels, items transiting one of the world's most critical shipping corridors, began reporting systematic navigation anomalies. GPS receivers showed vessels in impossible locations, on land, hundreds of kilometers from actual positions. This wasn't jamming, it was spoofing. The distinction matters enormously. Jamming overwhelms GPS signals with noise, making positioning impossible. Spoofing replaces genuine GPS signals with false ones, making positioning confidently wrong. A jammed ship knows it's blind. It slows down, proceeds with caution. A spoofed ship believes it knows exactly where it is. It proceeds at normal speed, toward the wrong location. Multiple vessels reported being guided by their navigation systems toward Iranian territorial waters without receiving any warning that their GPS data was fabricated. Insurance markets responded immediately. War risk premiums for Red Sea transits increased 15 to 30%. Shipping companies rerouted cargo around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, adding 10 to 14 days to transit times. That rerouting cost approximately $1 million per vessel in additional fuel and crew expenses. With hundreds of vessels affected, the cumulative cost ran into billions before the situation stabilized. And those costs passed through supply chains to consumers globally. A GPS spoofing campaign in the Red Sea added to the price of goods on shelves in Chicago, Berlin, and Tokyo. Invisible, untraceable, but economically real. Now the signal that changes the strategic picture entirely. GPS jamming has historically been local. A jammer operates within a limited radius, affecting ships in a specific sea lane, aircraft over a specific region, troops in a specific combat zone. The physics of radio frequency interference impose geographic limits, or they did. In August 2024, multiple intelligence agencies confirmed what satellite tracking data had been suggesting for months. Russia had deployed a new generation of electronic warfare capability aboard what publicly appeared to be standard communication satellites. These weren't ground-based jammers with limited range. These were orbital platforms capable of targeting GPS signals from space, affecting areas orders of magnitude larger than any ground system could reach. The operational range wasn't measured in kilometers. It was measured in thousands of kilometers. And the economic implications of that range change everything. Here's why orbital jamming is fundamentally different from ground-based jamming. A ground jammer can be located, targeted, and destroyed. It's a truck, a building, a fixed installation. Find it, strike it, problem solved. An orbital jammer is moving at 28,000 kilometers per hour, 400 kilometers above the atmosphere, protected by the same international norms that make attacking satellites an act of war with consequences no nation wants to trigger. You cannot simply shoot it down without creating a debris field that threatens every other satellite in that orbital zone, including your own. This is where the concept of Kessler syndrome becomes economically relevant. Donald Kessler was a NASA scientist who, in 1978, described a scenario that engineers had been quietly worried about for years. At a certain density of objects in low Earth orbit, collisions between satellites would create debris. That debris would cause more collisions, creating more debris. The cascade would accelerate beyond human ability to stop it. Eventually, certain orbital zones would become permanently unusable, filled with billions of fragments traveling at speeds that make any new satellite launch a near-certain collision. Kessler's scenario was theoretical in 1978. In 2024, the European Space Agency estimated that there are currently over 36,500 objects larger than 10 centimeters in Earth orbit, along with approximately 1 million objects between 1 and 10 centimeters. Each one is traveling fast enough to destroy a functioning satellite on impact. The threshold for Kessler syndrome isn't a cliff, it's a slope. And the global economy is sitting at the base of that slope, having built $1.4 trillion in daily financial activity on the assumption that the slope won't be climbed. The 2021 Russian anti-satellite missile test added over 1,500 trackable debris fragments to low Earth orbit in a single event. China's 2007 anti-satellite test created approximately 3,000 trackable fragments. Many of those fragments are still there, still moving, still colliding with smaller objects, creating fragments too small to track but large enough to damage satellites. But direct destruction of satellites is becoming strategically obsolete because there's a more sophisticated approach available now, co-orbital operations. In 2021, the U.S. Space Command publicly warned about Russian satellites designated Cosmos 2542 and Cosmos 2543 that had maneuvered to within striking distance of a U.S. reconnaissance satellite. They didn't attack it. They shadowed it for months. Military analysts described it as a stalker in space. These co-orbital vehicles don't need to destroy their targets to affect them. They can dazzle optical sensors with lasers, disrupting imaging capability without creating debris. They can jam communications between satellites and ground stations. They can position themselves to interfere with signal transmission patterns. All of this is reversible, deniable, and strategically ambiguous. Was it an equipment malfunction or deliberate interference? Proving the difference requires intelligence capabilities that take weeks to deploy in legal frameworks that don't yet exist for space. Meanwhile, the disruption happens in real time, in microseconds, in financial markets that can't pause and wait for a diplomatic resolution. There's a historical parallel that clarifies the economic stakes. September 1st, 1859. Telegraph operators across North America and Europe began reporting bizarre phenomena. Sparks jumping from equipment, paper igniting spontaneously, messages transmitting without battery power, a solar storm later named the Carrington event, after the astronomer who observed the triggering solar flare had hurled charged particles into Earth's magnetic field. Those particles induced massive electrical currents in the telegraph wires that crisscrossed the continent. The global telegraph network, the financial communication infrastructure of its era, collapsed within hours. Stock exchanges that depended on telegraphed price data went dark. Commodity markets lost synchronization between trading floors in different cities. Banks couldn't confirm wire transfers. The system recovered in days because the infrastructure was simple enough to repair quickly. Wires could be replaced, equipment could be swapped, and critically, there were backup systems, human couriers, physical mail, face-to-face transactions. Modern financial infrastructure has no comparable backup. When GPS timing fails, there's no human courier who can deliver microsecond accurate timestamps. There is no physical mail system fast enough to synchronize trading terminals across continents. The complexity of the dependency has outgrown the simplicity of any possible manual alternative. The 2012 solar storm reinforced this concern in quantifiable terms. The storm missed Earth by 9 days of orbital positioning. If Earth's orbit had been slightly different, or the storm slightly later, the planet would have taken a direct hit from an event comparable to the Carrington event. NASA modeled the economic consequences. The estimate exceeded $2 trillion in damages, with the majority attributable to satellite failures, power grid disruptions from GPS timing loss, and the cascading financial market effects of timestamp synchronization failures, $2 trillion from a solar storm that missed. That number represents what the global economy has built on top of a system designed in the 1970s, before anyone understood how comprehensively it would be adopted. The October 1973 oil shock offers a second historical parallel, one that maps more directly onto the current GPS vulnerability. When OPEC announced its oil embargo following the Yom Kippur War, oil prices quadrupled within weeks. Gas lines stretched for blocks. Industrial output declined. Inflation spiked across the Western world. The shock revealed something that economists had understood theoretically, but politicians had ignored practically. When a critical resource flows through a choke point that can be closed for political or strategic reasons, economic vulnerability becomes systemic. In 1973, the choke point was geographic. Tanker routes through the Persian Gulf and Mediterranean. In 2026, the choke point is technological. Signal transmission from 31 satellites broadcasting on frequencies anyone with sufficient equipment can disrupt. The 1973 embargo required the coordination of 13 nations, diplomatic agreements, tanker diversions, and weeks of preparation. A GPS disruption affecting financial markets requires a satellite in the right orbit, electronic warfare systems sophisticated enough to target specific frequency bands, and the political calculation that the disruption is deniable enough to avoid conventional retaliation. That calculation is becoming easier to make, not harder, because the attribution problem in electronic warfare is genuinely difficult. When a trading system reports timing synchronization errors, the immediate question is whether the source is a satellite malfunction, atmospheric interference, software error, or deliberate jamming. Answering that question takes hours, sometimes days. Sometimes it remains unresolved. Financial markets cannot wait hours for attribution analysis. Algorithms respond to anomalies in milliseconds. By the time anyone understands what caused a synchronization error, the market has already reacted to it, amplified it, and potentially created a cascade that looks like a flash crash. The 2010 flash crash happened without any external interference. Pure market dynamics, uncoordinated algorithms, and microsecond feedback loops created a $1 trillion disruption in 45 minutes. Now introduce deliberate timing anomalies, small enough to avoid immediate detection, targeted enough to affect specific market participants, timed to coincide with moments of market stress. The flash crash becomes a tool, not an accident, and its origin remains ambiguous enough to avoid the response that a missile strike would trigger. This is the economic warfare doctrine that emerges from GPS vulnerability. Not destruction, disruption, not invasion, interference. Not an act of war. An act that looks like a technical malfunction until someone with very specific intelligence capabilities proves otherwise. The insurance markets have already begun pricing this reality. In 2020, the average annual premium for satellite insurance coverage was approximately 2.5% of the satellite's replacement value. By 2023, that figure had risen to between 3.5 and 4.5%. For a single satellite worth $500 million, that's $10 to $20 million in additional annual insurance costs. Multiply across hundreds of commercial satellites, and the insurance cost increase represents billions of dollars annually flowing into risk pricing. Lloyd's of London quantified the scenario explicitly in a 2022 report. A GPS outage lasting 30 days would cost the U.S. economy approximately $1 billion per day. Aviation disruption, shipping paralysis, financial market dysfunction, emergency service degradation, $30 billion from 1 month of GPS silence. Lloyd's wasn't predicting this would happen. Lloyd's was pricing the probability that it could. And in the insurance business, pricing a probability means the probability is real. The response to this vulnerability has been fragmented and slow. Europe's Galileo system provides an alternative satellite navigation constellation. China's Beidou and Russia's GLONASS offer additional redundancy. But redundancy across multiple satellite systems doesn't solve the fundamental problem. All satellite navigation systems broadcast weak signals from predictable orbits on known frequencies. The physics that make GPS vulnerable apply equally to Galileo, Beidou, and GLONASS. More constellations mean more disruption required to create complete denial. But partial disruption of one system in specific geographic areas during specific time windows remains entirely achievable. And partial disruption, as the Red Sea and Eastern Europe have demonstrated, is sufficient to generate measurable economic consequences. The ground-based alternative is eLORAN. An updated version of the LORAN navigation system that predated GPS, eLORAN transmits powerful low-frequency signals from ground stations that are orders of magnitude harder to jam than satellite signals. The United States decommissioned its LORAN infrastructure in 2010, citing GPS as sufficient replacement. In 2020, Congress authorized a study into eLORAN restoration. As of 2024, that study remained incomplete, and no deployment timeline had been established. The gap between the vulnerability being identified and the alternative being deployed represents years during which the exposure remains unaddressed. South Korea took a different approach. Following the 2016 North Korean jamming campaign that disrupted over 1,000 aircraft and caused $300 million in economic damage in a single week, South Korea accelerated its eLORAN deployment program. Ground stations were installed. Receivers were mandated for critical infrastructure. South Korea now maintains a backup timing and navigation system that functions independently of satellites. The cost of that infrastructure was a fraction of the economic damage caused by a single week of GPS jamming. The calculation is straightforward. Build resilience before the disruption, or absorb the costs of the disruption without resilience. History suggests most economies choose the latter option repeatedly until the disruption becomes severe enough to force investment in alternatives. The telegraph operators who survived the 1859 Carrington event understood their infrastructure was fragile. They knew solar storms existed. They knew electrical surges could destroy equipment. What they didn't know was the scale of the storm they were about to experience, because no storm of that magnitude had occurred since the telegraph network was built. The global economy faces a structurally identical situation with GPS. The vulnerability is documented. The threat is demonstrated. The economic exposure is quantified. What remains unknown is the scale and timing of the disruption that will finally force systematic investment in alternatives. That disruption might come from a solar storm following the pattern of the 2012 near miss. It might come from the gradual accumulation of space debris reaching the density that Kessler predicted. It might come from electronic warfare capabilities expanding from regional conflicts to affect infrastructure that no one expected to be in range. Or it might come incrementally through dozens of small synchronization anomalies, each individually explainable as technical malfunction, collectively adding up to an economy operating at reduced efficiency without anyone identifying a single causal event. That last scenario is the most economically significant and the least visible, because markets can absorb dramatic visible shocks and recover. What markets struggle with is chronic, low-level uncertainty about the reliability of the infrastructure they depend on. When traders cannot fully trust timestamps, they build in margins. When shipping companies cannot fully trust GPS navigation, they add contingencies. When power grid operators cannot fully trust synchronization data, they maintain larger reserves. Each margin, each contingency, each reserve represents economic friction. Costs that don't appear in any single incident report, but accumulate across millions of daily decisions into a permanent drag on economic efficiency. The fourth economic domain isn't space itself. It's the reliability of the infrastructure space provides to every other economic domain below it. When that reliability is compromised, the effects don't appear dramatically on any single screen. They appear gradually in slightly wider bid-ask spreads, in slightly higher shipping insurance rates, in slightly increased reserve requirements, in slightly longer delivery windows. The economy becomes less efficient by degrees that are individually invisible and collectively significant. That's what silent blinding actually means in economic terms. Not darkness, dimness, not failure. Friction, not collapse, erosion. The satellites are still up there, the atomic clocks are still ticking, the signals are still broadcasting. But the confidence that those signals will always be available, always be accurate, always be trustworthy, that confidence is the thing that's quietly going dark. And confidence in financial markets, in supply chains, in infrastructure planning is not a soft variable. It's a hard economic input that shapes investment decisions, risk pricing, and the systemic efficiency of every market it touches. The 1973 oil shock didn't just raise gas prices. It fundamentally changed how Western economies thought about energy dependency. Strategic petroleum reserves were built. Alternative energy research was funded. Efficiency standards were mandated. All because a choke point was closed, and the cost of that closure was undeniable. The GPS choke point hasn't closed yet, but it has been demonstrated, tested, probed, and mapped by actors who understand its economic reach, better than most of the institutions that depend on it. The signals are there for anyone willing to read them. The South Korean jamming costs, the Red Sea spoofing premiums, the satellite insurance rate increases, the 2016 timing anomaly incident reports, the Space Force tracking data on objects with unexplained orbital behaviors. None of these signals individually predicts a specific outcome. All of them together describe an exposure that is growing faster than the resilience being built to address it. That gap between exposure and resilience is where economic risk lives, not in dramatic scenarios, not in worst-case predictions, in the measurable, documented, quietly widening distance between how dependent the global economy has become on GPS and how prepared it is to function without it. The clocks are ticking. 40 nanoseconds of precision, broadcast from 31 satellites, sustaining $1.4 trillion in daily activity. The question economic analysts are beginning to ask isn't whether that system is vulnerable. The evidence answers that question clearly. The question is whether the institutions that depend on it will build resilience before the vulnerability becomes a lesson. History has an answer to that question too. It's just not a comfortable one.